The morning sun was barely peeking through the windows of sunshine. Elementary school when 8-year-old Jake hurried down the hallway, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, and if you looked closely, you could see tiny specks of flour dusting the worn leather. Jake had been up since 5 in the morning, just like every other day, helping his dad prepare fresh bread at their small neighborhood bakery. Jake loved those early morning hours at the bakery. The warm smell of rising dough, the satisfying thud of kneading, and the proud smile on his father's face when a perfect loaf came out of the oven. But most of all, Jake loved creating things with his own hands. This morning had been extra special, because he had made something entirely by himself. A beautiful dinner roll that looked like a tiny work of art. As Jake slipped into his seat at the back of Mrs. Peterson's third-grade classroom, he carefully placed his backpack on the floor. Inside, wrapped in a clean kitchen towel, was his precious creation. He had shaped it perfectly, brushed it with egg wash until it gleamed, and even scored a delicate pattern on top. His dad had watched with amazement as Jake worked, shaking his head in wonder at his son's natural talent. The classroom slowly filled with other students. There was Tommy, whose parents were both doctors, bragging about his new expensive tablet. Lisa was showing off her designer shoes to anyone who would listen. And then there was Kevin, whose father owned the biggest car dealership in town, pulling out yet another brand new gadget from his designer backpack. Jake listened quietly, fingering the soft towel in his bag. His creation might not be expensive, but it was made with love and skill. He had put his heart into every fold and twist of the dough. Surely that meant something. Mrs. Peterson called the class to attention, her voice cutting through the morning chatter like a sharp knife. She was a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she had a way of looking at students that made them feel small. She had been teaching at Sunshine Elementary for over 20 years, and everyone knew she had her favorites, usually the children whose parents had important jobs or lots of money. "All right, class," Mrs. Peterson announced, adjusting her glasses. "It's time for show and tell. Who wants to go first?" Hands shot up around the room. Tommy waved his tablet eagerly. Lisa stood up, ready to model her new shoes. Kevin was practically bouncing in his seat, clutching his latest electronic toy. Mrs. Peterson's eyes scanned the room, deliberately passing over Jake as they always did. She called on Tommy first, who spent 10 minutes explaining every feature of his expensive device. The teacher nodded approvingly, asking thoughtful questions and praising Tommy's excellent presentation skills. Lisa went next, strutting to the front of the class in her designer shoes. Mrs. Peterson complimented her sophisticated taste and asked where her mother had purchased such lovely footwear. One by one, the privileged children shared their expensive toys, gadgets, and clothes. Mrs. Peterson's praise flowed freely, her voice warm and encouraging. She asked detailed questions, made positive comments, and even had the class give applause after each presentation. Jake watched it all, his stomach twisting with a mixture of hope and dread. Finally, when most of the usual students had gone, Mrs. Peterson's eyes reluctantly landed on him. "I suppose you have something to share too, Jake?" she asked, her voice already lacking the warmth she had shown the others. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he stood up. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his backpack and carefully unwrapped his dinner roll. It looked even more beautiful than he remembered, golden brown, perfectly shaped, with an intricate pattern scored into the top. The classroom filled with the faint, heavenly smell of fresh bread. "I made this myself this morning," Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a dinner roll. I got up early to make it at my dad's bakery." A few students leaned forward, genuinely interested. One girl even said, "Wow, that smells amazing." But Mrs. Peterson's expression remained cold and disapproving. She walked over to Jake's desk, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. She picked up the roll, holding it as if it were something distasteful. Her nose wrinkled slightly as she examined it, turning it over in her hands. "So this is what you've been doing with your time," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Playing with dough instead of focusing on your studies." Jake's face flushed red. But I did focus on my studies. I finished all my homework and I studied for today's spelling test." Mrs. Peterson ignored his explanation. She held the roll up for the entire class to see, her expression mocking. "Class, this is what happens when children waste their time on frivolous activities instead of pursuing real education." The warm, proud feeling in Jake's chest began to crumble. He watched in horror as Mrs. Peterson walked to the front of the room, still holding his creation. "Some children," she continued, her voice getting louder, "come from families with limited vision. They think that playing with flour and water is somehow valuable." She paused, looking directly at Jake. "But we know better, don't we, class?" "Hey!" Few students giggled nervously. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that something wasn't right. But Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished. "You see, children who come from certain backgrounds ... often lack the proper guidance to understand what's truly important in life." She was now standing directly in front of the trash can. "They bring in their little ... crafts, thinking they're somehow educational or impressive." Jake's eyes widened in disbelief as he realized what was about to happen. "Please don't," he whispered, but his voice was too quiet for anyone to hear. With a theatrical gesture, Mrs. Peterson dropped the dinner roll into the trash can. It landed with a soft thud, disappearing among the crumpled papers and pencil shavings. The beautiful pattern Jake had so carefully created was now hidden beneath garbage. "There," she said, dusting off her hands. "Now we can focus on things that actually matter." The classroom fell silent. Even the students who had been giggling looked shocked. Jake stared at the trash can, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. His masterpiece, the role he had poured his heart into, was gone. Worse than that, it had been dismissed as worthless garbage. Mrs. Peterson returned to her desk, shuffling through some papers as if nothing had happened. "Now then," she said cheerfully, "who can tell me what they learned from today's presentations?" Jake sank into his chair, his whole body trembling. The other students kept glancing at him, some with pity, others with the cruel curiosity that children sometimes have when witnessing someone else's humiliation. He could hear whispers starting around the room. "Did you see what she did? That was so mean. The bread actually smelled really good." But Jake heard none of it. All he could think about was the look of pride on his father's face that morning when Jake had shown him the finished roll. All he could remember was the hours he had spent perfecting his technique. The joy he had felt when everything came together perfectly. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat loudly. "Jake, I hope you've learned something today. Perhaps next time you'll bring something more ... appropriate to share with the class." Jake nodded numbly, not trusting his voice. He spent the rest of the morning in a daze, mechanically following along with lessons but not really hearing anything. Every time he glanced at the trash can, his stomach churned. When the lunch bell finally rang, Jake was the first one out of the classroom. He ran to the bathroom and locked himself in a stall, finally letting the tears fall. He had been so excited to share his creation, so proud of what he had accomplished. Now he felt small and worthless, just like Mrs. Peterson had made him feel. The worst part wasn't just that she had thrown away his role. It was the way she had done it, with such contempt and cruelty. She had made it clear that she thought he was beneath her, that his family's work was somehow shameful. As Jake sat in that bathroom stall, wiping his eyes with scratchy paper towels, he made a decision. He would never again bring anything from the bakery to school. He would never again try to share the thing he loved most. Mrs. Peterson had taught him a lesson. All right, but it wasn't the lesson she thought she was teaching. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Jake walked slowly toward Romano's family bakery. His backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down not by books but by the crushing embarrassment that had settled in his chest. Every step toward home felt like walking through thick mud. He kept replaying the moment when Mrs. Peterson had dropped his beautiful dinner roll into the trash, the sound echoing in his mind like a drum beat. As Jake pushed open the familiar glass door of the bakery, the little bell above chimed its usual cheerful welcome. The warm, yeasty smell that normally made him smile now felt overwhelming. His father, Antonio, looked up from behind the counter where he was arranging fresh loaves of bread in neat rows. His weathered hands, permanently stained with flour, paused in their work as he saw his son's face. "Hey there, my little baker," Antonio called out in his thick accent, his voice full of the warmth that always made Jake feel safe. "How did everyone like your dinner roll today?" Jake's throat tightened. He couldn't meet his father's eyes. Instead, he stared at the black and white checkered floor, the same pattern he had traced with his eyes thousands of times while helping in the bakery. "It was fine, Dad," he mumbled, his voice barely audible over the soft jazz music playing from the old radio in the corner. Antonio's bushy eyebrows furrowed. He had been running this bakery for 15 years, ever since he had moved to America, with dreams of building something better for his family. He knew his son better than anyone, and he could tell when something was wrong. Jake usually came home bubbling with excitement about his day, eager to share every detail about his classes and friends. "Just fine?" Antonio asked, wiping his hands on his apron. "But you worked so hard on that roll this morning. It was perfect, like something from a fancy restaurant." Jake's shoulders sagged even more. He remembered the pride in his father's voice. That morning, the way Antonio had called his wife over to see what their son had created. "Yeah, it was perfect," Jake whispered. The bakery wasn't busy at this time of day. Mrs. Chun from down the street was browsing the pastry case, and old Mr. Rodriguez was sitting at his usual corner table with his afternoon coffee and newspaper. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood bakery, the gentle hum of the display case, the soft clatter of plates being washed in the back, usually comforted Jake. Today, they felt distant and hollow. Antonio stepped out from behind the counter, his flour-dusted apron rustling. He was a big man with gentle eyes and hands that could create magic with dough. "Come help me with the evening bread," he said softly. "Your hands are still the best for shaping the small rolls." Jake shook his head, something he had never done before. "I don't want to," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I have homework." This was a lie, and they both knew it. Jake always did his homework at the small table in the back of the bakery, surrounded by the sounds and smells of baking. It was their routine, their special time together. Antonio's face fell, but he didn't push. "Okay, Mio, maybe tomorrow." Jake trudged toward the narrow staircase that led to their apartment above the bakery. Each step felt like a mountain to climb. He could hear his father moving around downstairs, probably wondering what had happened to change his usually cheerful son. Upstairs, the apartment was quiet. Jake's mother, Elena, wasn't home yet. She worked long hours at her job, and Jake knew she wouldn't be back until after dinner. He was grateful for this small mercy. He didn't think he could handle explaining his day to both parents. Jake threw his backpack onto his bed and collapsed beside it. His room was small but cozy, with posters of famous chefs on the walls and a shelf full of cookbooks he had collected over the years. Normally, he would flip through them, dreaming of all the things he wanted to learn to make. Today, he couldn't even look at them. The sounds of the bakery drifted up through the thin floor. Jake could hear his father working alone, probably wondering why his son had suddenly lost interest in the thing they both loved most. The thought made Jake's chest hurt even more. Downstairs, Antonio was indeed puzzled and worried. He had noticed the change in Jake the moment he walked in. The boy's usual bright energy was gone, replaced by something heavy and sad. Antonio had seen that look before on his own face in the mirror during the hardest days of building the bakery, when customers would look down on him because of his accent, or when suppliers would try to cheat him because they thought he was just another immigrant who didn't know better. As the afternoon wore on, the bakery began to fill with its usual after-school crowd. Children came in with their parents, pressing their faces against the glass case to stare at the colorful pastries. Parents chatted with Antonio about their days while their kids picked out cookies and cupcakes. It was usually Jake's favorite time of day, when he could watch the joy on people's faces as they discovered something delicious. But today, Jake remained upstairs, lying on his bed and staring at the ceiling. He could hear the laughter and conversations below, and they only made him feel more isolated. How could everyone else be so happy when his world felt like it was crumbling? Around 5 o'clock, Jake heard the familiar sound of high heels clicking up the stairs. His mother was home. Elena worked as a consultant for the state education department, though she rarely talked about her job at home. She preferred to focus on family time, asking about Jake's day and helping with his homework. "Jake, honey, I'm home," she called out as she reached the top of the stairs. "How was school today?" Jake pulled a pillow over his head. "Fine," he called. Back, his voice muffled, Elena paused outside his door. Like her husband, she could sense when something was wrong with their son. Jake was usually waiting for her at the top of the stairs, ready to tell her everything that had happened during his day. This was different. She knocked gently on his door. "Can I come in?" "I'm doing homework," Jake lied again. Elena opened the door anyway. She found Jake lying on his bed, still in his school clothes, with no books or papers in sight. Her heart clenched at the sight of her son's dejected posture. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. Jake turned away from her. "Nothing. I'm just tired." Elena reached out to smooth his hair, but Jake pulled away. This was so unlike him that Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Jake was normally affectionate and open, always ready to share his thoughts and feelings. "Did something happen at school today?" she asked gently. Jake's body tensed. "No, everything was fine." But Elena could see the lie in the set of his shoulders, in the way he wouldn't look at her. She had built her career on reading people, on understanding the subtle signs that revealed what someone was really thinking. Her son was hurting, and he was trying to hide it. "Jake, you can tell me anything. You know that, right?" Jake finally turned to look at her, and Elena saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. It was shame, deep and painful, the kind that came from being made to feel small and worthless. She had seen that look before in her own reflection. Years ago, when she had faced discrimination and prejudice in her climb through the education system. "I know, Mom," Jake whispered. "But I don't want to talk about it." Elena wanted to push, to demand answers, to fix whatever was hurting her son. But she also knew that sometimes pushing too hard could make things worse. Instead, she leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Okay," she said softly, "but I'm here when you're ready." As Elena left the room, she made a mental note to have a quiet conversation with Antonio. Something had happened to their son, something that had shaken his confidence and joy, and she intended to find out what it was. Downstairs, Antonio was closing up the bakery for the day. He had sold most of the bread and pastries, but his heart wasn't in the work like usual. He kept thinking about Jake's sad face, about the way his son had refused to help with the baking. It was like a piece of sunshine had gone out of his world. That evening, after Jake had barely touched his dinner and gone to bed early, Antonio and Elena sat at their small kitchen table, talking in low voices. Antonio told his wife about Jake's strange behavior, about how he had refused to help with the baking and claimed his presentation had gone fine, when clearly something was wrong. Elena listened carefully, her trained mind already working through possibilities. As someone who worked in education, she had seen too many children come home broken by thoughtless teachers and cruel classmates. The signs were all there: Jake's withdrawal, his shame, his sudden disinterest in the thing he loved most. "I think something happened at school," she said quietly. "Something that made him feel bad about the bakery, about what we do." Antonio's face darkened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think someone made him feel ashamed of being a baker's son." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Antonio's hands clenched into fists. He had faced plenty of discrimination in his life, but the thought of someone hurting his son because of it made his blood boil. "Who would do such a thing?" he asked. Elena's eyes hardened. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." As they sat in their small kitchen above the bakery, neither of them knew that this was just the beginning. Elena's mind was already working, already planning. She had spent years climbing the ladder in education, learning how the system worked and where its weaknesses lay. 3 days had passed since Jake's humiliating experience in Mrs. Peterson's classroom, and the weight of that moment still pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He had barely spoken to his parents, barely touched his food, and for the first time in his life he had stopped helping at the bakery. His father watched him with worried eyes, and his mother had started making quiet phone calls in the evenings, her voice too low for Jake to hear the words. What Jake didn't know was that his mother, Elena, had been busy. Very busy. On Wednesday morning, Elena sat in her car outside Sunshine Elementary School, watching the stream of children and parents arriving for another day of classes. She had taken the morning off work, telling her supervisor she had a family emergency that needed her attention. In a way, it wasn't a lie. Her son's well-being was the most important thing in her world, and she could feel that something was seriously wrong. Elena had spent the previous evening making careful phone calls to other parents in Jake's class. She had started with Mrs. Chun, whose daughter Amy was in the same grade. Mrs. Chun had been hesitant at first, but when Elena gently explained that Jake seemed upset about something that happened at school, the floodgates opened. "Oh, that poor boy," Mrs. Chun had said, her voice filled with sympathy. "Amy told me what happened during show and tell. It was terrible, just terrible. Mrs. Peterson threw away his beautiful bread roll and said some very cruel things." Elena's grip on the phone had tightened. What kind of things? Something about Baker's children not amounting to anything. Amy was so upset she came home crying. She said it wasn't fair, that Jake's bread smelled wonderful and looked like something from the fancy restaurant. Elena had thanked Mrs. Chun and immediately called the next parent on her list. And the next. And the next. By the end of the evening she had spoken to 6 different families, and the picture that emerged made her blood run cold. Mrs. Peterson had a pattern. A long, ugly pattern of targeting children from working-class families. Tommy's mother, who worked as a house cleaner, had been told her son lacked proper guidance at home. Maria's father, who drove a taxi, had been informed that his daughter came from a family with limited educational values. The stories went on, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Now, as Elena sat in her car watching the school, she was formulating a plan. She had connections in the education system, people who would listen to her concerns and take them seriously. But first, she needed to gather more information. She needed to understand exactly what kind of environment her son was facing every day. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. She had been keeping detailed records of every conversation, every incident, every parent's concern. Her years of working in education had taught her that documentation was everything. Without proof, complaints were just complaints. With proof, they became cases for change. At exactly 9 o'clock, Elena walked into the school's main office. The secretary, a friendly woman named Carol, looked up with a smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'd like to schedule a meeting with the principal," Elena said calmly. "I have some concerns about my son's classroom experience." Carol's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, I see. Is this about a specific incident?" "It's about a pattern of behavior that I believe needs to be addressed." Carol nodded and reached for the appointment book. "Mr. Davidson can see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Will that work?" Elena accepted the appointment and left the school, but she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the district office, where she had scheduled a meeting with Superintendent Patricia Cole. Elena had worked with Patricia on several education initiatives over the years, and she knew she could trust her to take the situation seriously. The district office was a modern building with glass walls and motivational posters about student success. Elena signed in at the front desk and waited in the lobby, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She was nervous, but she was also determined. No child should have to endure what Jake had experienced. Patricia Cole emerged from the elevator, her hand extended in greeting. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. "It's so good to see you. Though I have to admit, your phone call yesterday has me concerned." They walked together to Patricia's office, past walls lined with photos of smiling students and teachers. Elena couldn't help but wonder how many of those smiles were hiding pain. How many of those children were struggling with teachers who saw them as less than worthy? "Tell me what's going on," Patricia said as they settled into chairs around a small conference table. Elena opened her notebook and began to speak. She told Patricia about Jake's experience, about the dinner roll thrown in the trash, about the cruel words and public humiliation. But she didn't stop there. She shared the stories of the other parents. The pattern of discrimination that seemed to be woven into Mrs. Peterson's teaching approach. Patricia listened intently, occasionally asking questions or making notes. As Elena spoke, Patricia's expression grew more and more serious. She had been in education for over 20 years, and she had seen her share of problem teachers. But this sounded particularly troubling. "How long has this been going on?" Patricia asked. "Based on my conversations with other parents, at least 3 years, possibly longer." Patricia leaned back in her chair, processing the information. "Elena, these are serious allegations. If what you're telling me is true, this represents a significant failure on our part to protect our students." "I know," Elena said quietly. "That's why I'm here." Patricia stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the parking lot where buses were beginning to arrive for the afternoon dismissal. "I need to investigate this thoroughly. I'll start by reviewing Mrs. Peterson's file and speaking with other administrators. But I want you to know that I take this very seriously." Elena felt a surge of relief. She had made the right choice in coming to Patricia. "What happens next?" "Next, I gather evidence. I'll interview students, parents, and other teachers. I'll review classroom policies and procedures. And if I find that Mrs. Peterson has been engaging in discriminatory behavior, there will be consequences." Meanwhile, back at Sunshine Elementary, Jake was struggling through another difficult day. Mrs. Peterson had continued her subtle harassment, assigning him extra cleanup duties and making pointed comments about students who need to focus more on their studies. Jake had learned to keep his head down and avoid eye contact, but inside, he was dying a little more each day. During lunch, Jake sat alone at a corner table, picking at his sandwich. He had stopped bringing the fresh bread his father made each morning, instead asking for store-bought bread that tasted like cardboard. Several of his classmates had tried to approach him, but he had pushed them away, afraid that associating with him would make them targets too. Amy Chun, the girl whose mother had spoken to Elena, finally worked up the courage to sit across from him. "Jake, are you okay?" she asked softly. Jake looked up, surprised. "I'm fine." "No, you're not," Amy said firmly. "Ever since what happened with your bread roll, you've been different. Sad." Jake's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. "It doesn't matter." "Yes, it does," Amy insisted. "What Mrs. Peterson did was wrong. My mom said so," she said. "Your bread looked amazing, and that Mrs. Peterson was mean to throw it away." Jake stared at Amy, surprised by her kindness. "Your mom said that?" "She said a lot of things. She said Mrs. Peterson has been mean to lots of kids whose parents have regular jobs. She said it's not fair." For the first time in days, Jake felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe other people understood that what had happened was wrong. That afternoon, as Jake walked home from school, he noticed his mother's car parked outside the bakery. That was unusual. She normally didn't get home until after 5 o'clock. He found her in the kitchen upstairs, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a serious expression. "How was school today?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Jake shrugged. "Same as always." Elena studied her son's face. She could see the pain he was trying to hide, the way he had withdrawn into himself. It broke her heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Jake's stomach tightened. "What? What really happened with your dinner roll on Monday?" Jake's face went pale. He had been dreading this conversation, hoping his parents would never find out the details of his humiliation. "I told you, it was fine." "Jake, I know it wasn't fine. I can see how much it hurt you, and I think I know why." Jake's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "You don't understand, Mom. She said that baker's kids don't amount to anything. She said we come from families with limited vision. She threw away my roll like it was garbage." Elena's heart shattered as she listened to her son's words. She reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Jake, listen to me very carefully. What Mrs. Peterson said was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. Your father's work is honorable and important. The bread you make is beautiful and delicious. And you, my sweet boy, are going to amount to amazing things. Jake looked up at his mother, tears streaming down his face. But she's a teacher, Mom. Teachers are supposed to be smart. Maybe she's right. The next 2 weeks passed like a storm brewing on the horizon. While Jake continued to struggle through his days at school, trying to become invisible in Mrs. Peterson's classroom, Elena was working behind the scenes with the precision of a master chess player. She had spent countless hours documenting every incident, every complaint, every pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination. Superintendent Patricia Cole had been equally busy. She had quietly interviewed teachers, reviewed student files, and most importantly, she had begun speaking with former students and their parents. What she discovered made her stomach turn. Mrs. Peterson's behavior wasn't just recent, it had been going on for over a decade, targeting children from working-class families with ruthless consistency. On a crisp Thursday morning, Patricia sat in her office reviewing the thick file that had grown on her desk. Inside were sworn statements from 18 different families, documentation of inappropriate comments, and even some audio recordings that concerned parents had made during parent-teacher conferences. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Patricia picked up her phone and dialed Elena's number. Elena, I need you to come in. We need to talk. An hour later, Elena sat across from Patricia, her hands folded in her lap. But there was something different about her today. She seemed calmer, more composed, as if she had been preparing for this moment. The investigation is complete, Patricia said, her voice heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. Elena, what Mrs. Peterson has been doing is far worse than we initially thought. She's been systematically targeting children from working-class backgrounds for years, Elena nodded slowly. I know. I've been doing some investigating of my own. There's something else, Patricia continued. I've spoken with the school board and they've agreed that immediate action needs to be taken. We're scheduling a formal hearing for next week. Elena's eyes sharpened. What kind of hearing? A disciplinary hearing that will likely result in Mrs. Peterson's immediate suspension and probable termination. But Elena, I need you to know that this is going to be difficult. Mrs. Peterson has been at the school for 23 years. She has supporters, people who think she's just being tough on students. Elena smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. Patricia, there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned from the beginning. Patricia raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean that I haven't been entirely honest about who I am. Before Patricia could respond, Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. She slid it across the desk with steady hands. Patricia picked up the card and her face went pale. Dr. Elena Rodriguez-Williams, State Education Commissioner. She looked up at Elena with wide eyes. You're the new commissioner? But I thought you were just a consultant. I am the new commissioner, Elena said calmly. And I've been working undercover for the past 6 months, living in different communities to understand the real challenges facing our schools. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You've been ... undercover? My husband and I decided to live simply, to blend in with working families so I could see the education system from the ground up. We rented the apartment above the bakery. Antonio took a job there to maintain our cover, and I took a consulting position that allowed me to work remotely while observing local schools. Patricia stared at Elena in shock. So when Mrs. Peterson was humiliating your son, she had no idea she was targeting the child of the most powerful person in the state education system. Elena's eyes hardened. None whatsoever. And that's exactly why her behavior is so revealing. She didn't discriminate against Jake because she thought she could get away with it due to politics or connections. She did it because she genuinely believes that children from working-class families are worth less than others. Patricia leaned back in her chair, trying to process this revelation. Elena, this changes everything. If the media finds out that a teacher humiliated the education commissioner's son, the media isn't going to find out, Elena said firmly. This isn't about revenge or publicity. This is about justice for Jake and for all the other children who have been hurt by this woman's prejudice. Patricia nodded slowly. What do you want? To do, Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the school buses lined up outside. I want to confront her directly. I want her to understand exactly what she's done and who she's done it to. And then I want her removed from her position so she can never hurt another child. When? Today, this afternoon. I want you to arrange a meeting with Mrs. Peterson. Tell her there's a parent complaint that needs to be addressed immediately. Patricia hesitated. Are you sure about this? Once you reveal who you are, there's no going back. Elena turned to face her. Patricia, I've spent my entire career fighting for children who don't have a voice. I've worked in boardrooms and legislative halls, writing policies and procedures. But this is my son. This is personal. And Mrs. Peterson is about to learn that she chose the wrong family to bully. That afternoon, Mrs. Peterson sat in the principal's office, tapping her foot impatiently. She had been told that a parent had filed a complaint and that the superintendent wanted to meet with her immediately. She wasn't worried. She had dealt with complaining parents before, and she was confident she could handle whatever minor issue had been raised. When Elena walked into the office, Mrs. Peterson barely looked up. She saw a woman in simple clothes, someone she assumed was just another working-class parent causing trouble. Mrs. Peterson, Principal Davidson said, I'd like you to meet Dr. Elena Rodriguez-Williams. Mrs. Peterson glanced up dismissively. Doctor, are you Jake's mother? I wasn't aware you had a medical degree. Elena smiled coldly. I don't have a medical degree, Mrs. Peterson. I have a doctorate in education policy. And I'm not here as Jake's mother, though that's certainly part of it. Mrs. Peterson looked confused. I don't understand. Elena walked to the chair directly across from Mrs. Peterson and sat down. Let me help you understand. 2 weeks ago, you took a beautiful dinner roll that my 8-year-old son made with his own hands, and you threw it in the trash. You told your class that children from bakers' families don't amount to anything. You said we come from families with limited vision. Mrs. Peterson's face flushed. Now wait just a minute. I was trying to teach the children about appropriate classroom presentations. That boy brought food to show and tell, which is clearly against policy. Is it? Elena asked calmly. Because I've reviewed the official policy, and there's nothing that prohibits food items during presentations. But even if there were, that wouldn't excuse your behavior. Mrs. Peterson straightened in her chair. I've been teaching for 23 years, and I know how to manage my classroom. Some children need to learn that there are standards in education. Standards, Elena repeated. Tell me, Mrs. Peterson, what standards were you teaching when? You told Tommy Rodriguez that his mother's job as a house cleaner meant he lacked proper guidance at home. Mrs. Peterson's confidence wavered. I don't recall saying anything like that. Really? Because Tommy's mother recorded your conversation during their parent-teacher conference. Just like Maria's father recorded yours when you told him that taxi drivers' children come from families with limited educational values. Double quote. Mrs. Peterson's face went white. You can't record private conversations without permission. Actually, you can when those conversations take place in a public school setting and involve potential discrimination. But that's not the point. Elena leaned forward. The point is that you have been systematically targeting children from working-class families for years, making them feel ashamed of their parents' honest work. I resent that accusation, Mrs. Peterson said, but her voice lacked conviction. Elena opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Peterson, I have documented evidence of your discriminatory behavior affecting 18 different families over the past 5 years. I have recordings, written statements, and testimony from former students who are now adults. Mrs. Peterson stared at the folder as if it were a poisonous snake. Who are you? What do you want? Elena stood up slowly. I told you who I am. I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez-Williams. But what I haven't told you is my current position. She walked to the window and looked out at the playground where children were playing during recess. I'm the state education commissioner. Mrs. Peterson, I'm the person who sets education policy for this entire state. The color drained completely from Mrs. Peterson's face. That's impossible. The commissioner lives in the state capitol. She works in government buildings. I've been working undercover for 6 months, living in communities like this one to understand the real challenges facing our schools. My husband and I rented the apartment above Romano's bakery. Antonio took a job there to maintain our cover, while I observed local schools. Mrs. Peterson's mouth opened and closed silently. She looked like she might be sick. So when you humiliated my son, when you threw away his beautiful creation and told him that Baker's children don't amount to anything, you weren't just attacking a random 8-year-old boy. You were attacking the son of the person who has the power to change everything about how this state approaches education. 6 months had passed since that dramatic afternoon in Principal Davidson's office, and the changes at Sunshine Elementary were remarkable. The halls that had once echoed with whispered fears about Mrs. Peterson now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one filled with respect, inclusion, and genuine learning. Jake walked through those same halls with his head held high, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he hurried to his new classroom. Miss Rivera, his new teacher, was everything Mrs. Peterson had never been: kind, encouraging, and genuinely interested in each student's unique background and talents. She had made it clear from day one that every family's work was valuable, whether they were doctors, teachers, mechanics, or bakers. As Jake settled into his seat, he couldn't help but smile at the memory of yesterday's science fair. For months, he had been working on a project that combined his love of baking with his growing interest in chemistry. With his father's help and Ms. Rivera's encouragement, he had created a presentation called "The Science of Bread: How Chemistry Creates Magic." The project had been a huge success. Jake had explained to the judges how yeast works as a living organism, how gluten forms networks that trap gas bubbles, and how the Maillard reaction creates the golden brown crust that makes bread so appealing. He had brought samples of different types of bread, each demonstrating a different scientific principle, but the best part had been the look of pride on his parents' faces as they watched him present. Antonio had stood in the back of the gymnasium, still wearing his flour-dusted apron from the bakery, tears streaming down his cheeks. Elena had recorded every moment, her own eyes shining with joy as she watched her son confidently explain complex chemical processes to impress judges. Jake had won second place in the chemistry category, but to him it felt like he had won everything that mattered. He was proud to be a baker's son again. More than proud, he was excited about it. The transformation hadn't just affected Jake. Word of Mrs. Peterson's dismissal and the reasons behind it had spread throughout the school district, creating ripple effects that Elena hadn't expected. Other teachers began examining their own attitudes towards students from different backgrounds. Parents felt more comfortable speaking up when they witnessed unfair treatment. And most importantly, children from all kinds of families began to feel valued and respected. Elena had used the incident as a springboard for sweeping changes across the state education system. She had implemented new anti-discrimination policies, created teacher training programs focused on cultural sensitivity, and established anonymous reporting systems for students and parents. But perhaps most significantly, she had started a program called Every Job Matters, which brought parents from all professions into classrooms to share their knowledge and experiences. The program had been wildly successful. Children learned about engineering from mechanics, discovered the science of nutrition from restaurant workers, and explored the mathematics of construction from carpenters. The artificial barriers between important and unimportant work began to crumble as students realized that every job required skill, knowledge, and dedication. Antonio had become one of the program's most popular speakers. He visited schools throughout the district, teaching children about the art and science of baking. His gentle manner and obvious passion for his craft captivated students, and many began to see baking not as simple manual labor, but as a complex skill that combined chemistry, mathematics, timing, and creativity. On this particular morning, Jake was especially excited because his father was coming to speak to his class about the history of bread around the world. As Antonio entered the classroom carrying a large basket covered with a crisp white cloth, the students erupted in excited whispers. "Good morning, everyone," Antonio said, his accent thick but his voice confident. "Today we're going to travel around the world without leaving this room. We're going to explore different cultures through their bread." Ms. Rivera smiled as she watched her students lean forward with anticipation. This was exactly the kind of learning experience she believed in, one that connected academic subjects to real-world knowledge and celebrated the diversity of human experience. Antonio uncovered his basket to reveal an amazing assortment of bread from different countries. There was challah from Jewish tradition, naan from India, sourdough from San Francisco, baguettes from France, and injera from Ethiopia. Each bread told a story about the people who created it, the climate where it was developed, and the ingredients that were available in different parts of the world. "Bread is like a history book," Antonio explained as he broke off pieces for the students to taste. "Every culture has its own way of making bread, and those differences tell us about how people lived, what they grew, and what they valued." Jake watched his classmates' faces light up as they tasted the different breads and learned about their origins. Amy Chun raised her hand excitedly. "My grandmother makes steamed buns? Are those a kind of bread too?" "Absolutely," Antonio replied. "Would you like to tell us about them?" For the next hour, the classroom became a celebration of diversity. Students shared stories about their own family's traditional foods, and Antonio helped them understand the science and history behind each one. It was exactly the kind of inclusive, engaging education that Elena had envisioned when she started her reforms. After Antonio's presentation, Ms. Rivera gathered the class for their daily reflection time. "What did you learn today?" she asked. Hands shot up around the room. Tommy, whose mother was a house cleaner, said, "I learned that my mom's job is important because clean spaces help people stay healthy, just like good food helps people stay strong." Lisa, whose parents were both lawyers, added, "I learned that there are lots of different ways to be smart, and they're all valuable." But it was Kevin's comment that made Jake's heart swell with pride. Kevin, whose father owned the car dealership, and who used to brag about his family's wealth, raised his hand and said, "I learned that Jake's dad is like a scientist and an artist and a historian all at the same time." "That's really cool." Jake beamed as his classmates nodded in agreement. The boy who had once felt ashamed of his family's work now felt like the luckiest kid in the world. That afternoon, as Jake walked home from school, he took a different route that led him past the district office where his mother worked. Through the large windows, he could see Elena in a meeting with other education officials, probably planning more programs to help students like him feel valued and included. Jake smiled as he remembered the conversation he had overheard between his parents. The night before, they had been discussing whether to reveal Elena's true identity to the community or continue living their undercover life. In the end, they had decided to stay. The bakery had become their real home, and the community had become their real family. When Jake arrived at Romano's family bakery, he found it busier than ever. Word about Antonio's incredible baking skills had spread throughout the district, and parents often stopped by to purchase bread and pastries while sharing stories about their children's experiences at school. The bakery had become an unofficial community center, a place where people from all backgrounds came together over shared appreciation for good food and honest work. "How was school today, my little baker?" Antonio asked as Jake tied on his small apron. "Perfect," Jake replied, rolling up his sleeves. "Can you teach me how to make challah? I want to bring some to Amy's family. Her grandmother is visiting from China, and I thought she might like to try American bread." Antonio's face split into a huge grin. "Of course. But first, let me tell you the story behind challah bread and the special meaning it has for Jewish families. As father and son worked side by side, kneading dough and sharing stories, Elena watched from the window upstairs. Her heart was full as she saw how confident and proud her son had become. The boy who had once been ashamed of his family's work was now eager to share it with others. The smell of baking bread filled the apartment, just as it had 6 months ago. But everything else had changed. Jake was no longer the scared, humiliated child who had come home with flour on his shoes and shame in his heart. He was a confident young man who understood that his family's work was valuable, that his own talents were worthy of respect, and that he could achieve anything he set his mind to. Mrs. Peterson, meanwhile, had been forced to find a new career after her teaching license was revoked. The last anyone heard, she was working at a desk job in a different state, hopefully learning that honest work comes in many forms and that every person deserves respect regardless of their profession. As the sun set over the bakery, Elena joined her husband and son in the kitchen. Together they prepared for the next day's orders, their hands working in perfect harmony as they shaped dough into beautiful loaves and pastries. They were just a family running a small neighborhood bakery, but they were also so much more. They were proof that dignity comes from within, that every honest job has value, and that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to live humbly among the communities they serve.